All right, let's dive right in, shall we? Today's deep dive is going to be fascinating, I think. We're going to be talking about circumcision rates across the U.S.
Oh, yeah. It's a really interesting topic.
I know our listeners were really excited about this one. There's a surprising amount of variation across the country.
Right. You wouldn't necessarily expect it.
No, not at all. And this goes along with a really cool choropleth map that really shows you just how much variation there is.
Yeah, it really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
Are you ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling, facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
Honestly, it's a little wild, right? It's like looking at a snapshot of a country divided.
Yeah, it's crazy how much it varies from region to region. You'd think something like this would be more uniform across the entire country,
Yes!
Especially in this day and age.
Right, exactly. But it's obvious that history and culture, even healthcare access, all play a big role. That's what we're going to unpack today, right?
Absolutely. We are going to look at how we got here, why some areas are holding on to those higher rates while other areas have basically abandoned it, and then what those differences might mean for men and women living in those different regions.
Okay, so just to get us all on the same page, we're talking about the surgical removal of the foreskin, typically done on newborn males.
Right. And it's a procedure that has been around for centuries. Practices vary across cultures and religions.
And in the U.S., it really became like a medical standard in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I was reading that doctors were promoting it as a way to prevent all kinds of things like syphilis, even masturbation.
It's really interesting how medical beliefs have changed so much over time. Back then, circumcision was seen as like this modern medical advancement, a way to prevent disease and all that.
But as time went on and research continued, those claims kind of unraveled.
Yeah, and that's where the AAP comes in, the American Academy of Pediatrics. They've kind of been the ones guiding how doctors approach circumcision.
Right.
Their stance has changed over time, reflecting the latest scientific evidence. And while they acknowledge potential benefits like a slightly reduced risk of UTIs in infants and a lower risk of STIs later in life, they don't recommend routine circumcision for all baby boys.
So they're saying there's benefits and drawbacks. It's not a black and white decision. Talk to your doctor, make an informed choice.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective, along with the growing awareness of potential complications, really started to have an effect on circumcision rates starting in the second half of the 20th century.
And that's where our map for today's deep dive comes in. Circumcision rates by state 2025 paints a pretty clear picture of how those trends have played out regionally.
Just imagine a map of the U.S. where the Northeast is this really dark blue, representing states with circumcision rates of 80% or higher.
Wow. So places like Maine, Vermont, New York, even Pennsylvania.
They are all holding on to those historically high rates.
It's like the medical practices of a previous era are still lingering in those regions.
Yeah, and then as you move westward, the blue starts to fade.
It's like it's being diluted.
By the time you hit the West Coast, it's practically a pale yellow.
Signifying rates below 20%.
Yeah. California, Oregon, Washington, they're all in that range.
So what's happening out west? Is it just a different mindset culturally?
Well, the West Coast is known for its emphasis on individual choice and bodily autonomy. It's also a region that's been shaped by a lot of immigration from cultures where circumcision is less common.
Right.
So you've got this convergence of cultural shifts and demographic changes that likely play a role in those lower rates.
Okay, but before we go too deep into the whys of all these regional differences, let's finish our tour of the map. What about the South? It seems like a mixed bag down there.
The South is where it gets really interesting. It's this patchwork of blue and yellow. Like the region is wrestling with this issue.
You've got Alabama and Mississippi at one extreme with practically no circumcisions happening.
Right.
And then Tennessee and Kentucky right next door are at 100%.
It's mind-boggling, isn't it? And then you've got Georgia and South Carolina somewhere in between.
And Florida, of course, that outlier down there at 20%, surrounded by all those higher rate states.
Florida's a fascinating case. It's
Yeah.
got this really unique blend of different cultures, a large transient population, a large Hispanic community, where circumcision may not be as prevalent.
Right.
So all those factors could be contributing to its lower rate.
It's like Florida is like a miniature version of the national trend, where you have this clash between traditional practices and changing attitudes.
Right, and then you have those outliers that really defy easy explanation.
You're talking about Colorado and Hawaii.
Exactly. Colorado at 60%, right in the middle of the country, doesn't neatly fit into any regional pattern.
And Hawaii at 100%.
A tiny blue dot in a sea of yellow.
It makes you wonder what's going on out there, doesn't it?
It does.
Okay, so we've got this map showing a nation divided on circumcision. What are some of the key things driving these differences?
Well, as we've mentioned, historical trends play a huge role. The regions that adopted circumcision early on seem to be holding on to those practices, even as the medical reasoning has shifted.
It's almost like those beliefs got embedded in the culture passed down from generation to generation.
Right, but then you have these cultural changes happening, especially in the West, with a movement toward more bodily autonomy and, people questioning routine medical interventions.
It's like those regions are saying, hey, maybe we don't need to mess with nature unless it's absolutely necessary.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's religion, which has always been a part of circumcision practices.
Right. But it doesn't completely explain everything, does it?
No. You've got New York with a large Jewish population and high rates of circumcision, and then California, which is also diverse, but with much lower rates.
It's a good reminder that even within those cultural or religious influences, individual choice and personal beliefs are still important.
Right.
So we've got history, culture, religion all tied up together. What else should we consider?
Well, we can't ignore healthcare access and just attitudes towards healthcare. In some areas, access to care and the advice doctors give might be influencing what parents decide.
Right.
And then there's the cost.
Right, because even something seemingly simple like circumcision has a cost.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll get into those financial aspects a little later. We'll look at things like insurance coverage and affordability and how those things might play a role in those regional differences.
Sounds good. Now, before we move on to how men and women view this whole thing, let's wrap up this part by looking at some of the most interesting facts that stood out to us from our research.
Okay.
All right, first one. Did you know that the U.S. is actually an outlier globally when it comes to circumcision rates?
It's true. Historically, about 80% of males in America have been circumcised. That's way higher than other developed nations. Canada is around 30%, and the UK is around 20%.
It's pretty crazy how different the U.S. is.
But like our 2025 map shows that national average is becoming less and less representative of what's actually happening.
Yeah, that national picture is fragmenting, showing us a much more complex reality.
Okay, and here's another interesting thing. Those 0% rates in Alabama and Mississippi,
Yeah. Given how long circumcision has been practiced in the U.S., those numbers are pretty shocking.
it's like those states are making a conscious decision to break away from the past.
And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got Hawaii at 100%.
A real mystery.
What is it about Hawaii that's keeping those rates so high while the rest of the West Coast has basically given it up?
We may have to do an entirely separate deep dive just on Hawaii.
It would be interesting for sure. Okay, last one. National circumcision rates have been going down for decades.
Yeah, they've dropped from about 90% in the 1970s to under 60% now.
What does it all mean? What's the takeaway from all these historical trends and all these regional differences?
I think it shows us that even a seemingly straightforward medical procedure like this is closely tied to cultural norms, beliefs, and tradition.
And as we move into the 21st century, the landscape of circumcision in America is likely to keep changing in ways we might not expect.
Absolutely. It reflects a society that is coming to terms with evolving medical views, changing cultural values, and the power of individual choice.
So we've covered the history, looked at all the regional variations, and talked about some interesting facts. But there's another important side to this. The impact all these differences have on the lives of men and women across the country.
In the next part, we'll shift our focus from the big picture to the individual level.
We'll see how these different circumcision rates by region might be shaping male identity, female experiences, and even starting conversations about public health.
It should be interesting.
Stay with us. So we've been looking at this map of circumcision rates, and where you live can really have a big impact on how you view this whole thing. Let's zoom in a little. What does this mean for guys growing up in these different places?
It's really interesting to think about, right? Like how those regional trends might shape how a guy sees his own body. Imagine growing up somewhere like Maine, where circumcision is super common.
Yeah.
It's like the unspoken norm. So a young man in that environment probably doesn't even think twice about it. It's just what's normal to them.
But then picture a guy from California where it's not as common. They're exposed to more variety, so maybe they have a different outlook.
Right, and that difference in perspective could lead to some pretty interesting conversations when people from these different areas get together.
Oh, yeah, totally. Can you imagine like a college dorm room? One guy's from Vermont, the other one's from California. They're getting ready to go work out. Talk about an icebreaker.
That's a great point. Could be a moment of, surprise or even just a little awkwardness as those cultural assumptions kind of bump into each other.
And it's not just about what you see, right? It's about how you talk about it, too. Like in those high circumcision areas, is it even a topic of conversation?
Yeah, that's a good question. It might be so normal in those places that it's not even something people talk about. It's just a given.
Whereas in the areas where it's less common, maybe it's something that's more open to discussion, maybe even debate.
Exactly. And that openness could lead to more awareness of the pros and cons, the risks,
Right.
the benefits, all of that. And that could then influence individual choices.
Okay, so we talked about the male perspective, but obviously this isn't just a guy thing. Women are a part of this too.
Absolutely. And their experiences and preferences are probably shaped by those regional norms too.
It makes sense. If you've grown up and dated mostly guys from an area with high circumcision rates, then you probably have certain expectations, both,
Wow.
Aesthetically and just the whole experience.
Yeah, you're right. And it's not necessarily about judgment or liking one over the other. It's more about what you're used to.
It's like if you've always eaten spicy food and then suddenly you try something mild, it might just seem different. Not bad, just different.
Oh, that good analogy. And the same thing could apply to women who have mostly had partners that were uncircumcised. Their expectations would be shaped by that.
And that could be a big adjustment for someone moving from, let's say, the Midwest to the West Coast or the other way around.
Yeah. All of a sudden, they're dealing with a whole new set of unspoken rules and expectations.
And we can't forget about those studies that show circumcision can reduce the risk of spreading some infections to female partners.
Right. That adds another layer to the whole conversation.
Especially in places where it's less common. It makes you think about how that information gets shared, in relationships.
Yeah.
It's like all of a sudden a personal medical decision has implications for public health, even relationships.
It shows how connected these issues are.
Okay, so we've talked about men, women, cultural norms. So what does all this mean looking ahead? If those national rates keep going down, will circumcision just disappear in the U.S.?
Hard to say for sure. Those cultural and historical influences we talked about, especially in certain regions, are powerful.
Even if the medical world changes its mind completely, those beliefs might stick around for a long time.
Yeah, like a cultural inertia. But then at the same time, we're seeing these younger generations in those areas with lower rates embrace a more individual approach to healthcare. They're questioning those old ideas, doing their own research, and making choices that work for them.
So maybe it's not about if it's more about how it continues and how those regional differences will change over time.
Exactly. And it's pretty fascinating. Shows how medicine culture, personal choice are shaping this old practice.
It really is. Shows the importance of being open and honest and talking about these things so people can make decisions they feel good about.
I agree.
Okay, so before we finish up this deep dive, there's one more thing we should look at.
I think I know what you mean.
You got it. Let's talk about money. Because in the U.S., healthcare is never free.
That's for sure. Circumcision isn't any different.
In the last part of our deep dive, we'll take a look at the costs of circumcision, who pays how much, and how that all plays into these regional differences. All right, so we're back for the last part of our look at circumcision rates across America. We've talked about history, culture, and what it's like for people. But, in this country, healthcare decisions often just come down to money.
That's true. Even a fairly quick procedure like circumcision is not immune to those economic realities.
So how much does it actually cost to have a circumcision done?
Well, it can really vary. Depends on where you live, who's doing it, and the type of anesthesia they use.
Right.
But usually you're probably looking at a few $100 on the low end to a couple thousand on the high end.
Okay, so not exactly cheap. And who usually pays?
For babies, health insurance will usually cover at least some of the cost. But like a lot of medical procedures, coverage can be different from plan to plan.
Yeah. Insurance can be a real pain to figure out.
Exactly. Some might cover all of it, some might cover a little, and some might not cover any of it.
And that's where those regional differences we've been talking about might actually matter. in areas with really high circumcision rates like the Northeast, maybe insurance coverage has been better, and that's made it more affordable for families.
It could be. It's not just about cultural norms or what people prefer. It's about what they can actually afford, too.
Right.
Even if insurance covers part of it, there might be deductibles or copays that families have to come up with.
And for families that are already struggling financially, even a couple $100s could be a big problem.
Exactly. So it makes sense that money could be a factor in why circumcision rates are lower in some places, especially in areas where people don't make as much money or where insurance isn't as good.
But there's also the idea that circumcision could save money over time, right?
Yeah, that's what people who support the procedure will say. They'll say that circumcision can lower the chances of some health problems down the road. Things like urinary tract infections or penile cancer or some STIs.
So it becomes a question of weighing the costs and the benefits.
Right. But it's not that simple. Those potential savings are over a person's whole life. But the cost of the procedure is right now.
And it's not like someone who's circumcised is guaranteed to never have those health issues.
That's true. There are no guarantees with health.
Seems like the financial side of this is just as complicated as the cultural and medical parts we talked about.
Yeah, it is. It's a good reminder that decisions about healthcare, even something like this, aren't made in isolation. They're influenced by all kinds of things. What people believe, advice from doctors, cultural norms, and money, of course.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into circumcision rates, what are some of the most important things you hope people listening will take away?
I think the biggest thing is that there's no right answer for everyone. What's considered normal or the best thing to do is totally different depending on where you live. And it's shaped by history, culture, medicine, personal values, and finances.
It's kind of like America itself.
Right.
Diverse, always changing.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to talk about this with sensitivity and respect. You have to be open to different points of view.
Because whether a family chooses to circumcise or not, it's a very personal choice, and people should be able to make it without being judged.
I think you put that perfectly.
Well, this has been really interesting. Hopefully everyone listening learned some new things about this topic.
I hope so.
And remember, this is just the start of the conversation. There's always more to learn, more to explore, and more to talk about. So keep being curious, everyone, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.